female psychologist with too much to say. What's the surprise in that? Okay, so the framework. Alternative explanations of political assassinations, terrorist attacks, and other national tragedies that differ from official state accounts are sometimes dismissed by the general public because they evoke strong cognitive dissonance, a psychological phenomenon which occurs when new ideas or information conflict with previously formed ideologies and accepted beliefs. One approach to dealing with cognitive dissonance is to directly challenge the false belief itself. For example, by presenting evidence that the belief is factually incorrect. This is what most of the presentations at these hearings have done so far, and rightly so and appropriately so. Thus, what I'm going to present on now, and even demonstrate, is the other method, the indirect approach. Now, the indirect approach, rather than challenging false beliefs directly, instead first points out the potential for the creation and persistence of false beliefs in general. This entails first demonstrating mechanisms by which beliefs can be manipulated, and then subsequently exploring what specific beliefs may have been generated falsely. Thus, before I challenge any false beliefs that may be held about the events of 9/11, I will first explain in detail how people can come to hold false beliefs in general. I expect that after I walk you through this, you will be better able to understand why the direct approach, just merely presenting evidence that the false belief is factually incorrect, not often only fails to change the false belief, but sometimes serves to strengthen it. Okay? In psychology, a false belief generally refers to one that has been manipulated, often purposely and outside of the person's awareness, and sometimes in a very specific direction or misdirection. An elegant and robust example comes from the work of Solomon Asch in the 1940s and Harold Kelly in the 1950s, and later replicated by others, including Neil Widmeyer and John Lloyd in the late 1980s. And Widmeyer and Lloyd's paper is the one that I'm going to be focusing on. This experimental manipulation of beliefs is referred to as the warm-cold effect. In a classroom setting, students in Widmeyer and Lloyd's experiment were given different introductions to a visiting professor and later asked to describe the professor and his lecturing abilities. But before the professor appeared, half of the students were informed that he was a rather cold person, and the other half were informed that he was a rather warm person. In addition, students in both groups were also told that he was either a professor of physical education or a professor of social psychology. Okay? So we have two things. You're told either he's a warm or cold person, and then of those groups you're also told whether he is a professor of social psychology or education. Okay? All the students experienced the exact same lecture, which was delivered in a very neutral manner. Okay? The results showed that students who were led to believe that the lecturer was a warm person not only reported that he was much more likable than students led to believe he was a cold person, they also reported that he was a more competent teacher. This is an example of a false belief because the liking or disliking and the perceptions of competency and incompetency arose from the warm or cold introduction and not from the professor's actual mannerisms or methods of teaching, which were all identical for students. Most importantly, the information regarding the professor's area of expertise, as either a professor of physical education or social psychology, had no effect on students' perceptions. And this is a footnote, particularly for Professor Jenkins. Neither the area of expertise nor the student's own gender had any interactive effects with the warm or cold manipulation itself. Now, this experimental example has real-world consequences for a functioning democracy, such as when people can be manipulated, for example, by the media, into falsely believing that they like or dislike a presidential candidate because of his or her public policy, when in fact the perception arises solely from the media's framing of the candidate merely as likable or dislikable. The issue of competency to hold the highest position of public office does not even need to factor into the equation. Indeed, the creation and persistence of false beliefs can have very serious consequences. A case in point was demonstrated by Steve Hoffman and his colleagues in their paper entitled, "There Must Be a Reason: Osama, Saddam, and inferred justification, which attempted to explain the strong but false belief held by many Americans that Saddam Hussein was involved in the terrorist attacks of September 11th. It also demonstrates why the direct approach often only serves to strengthen the false belief. And here's a quote from their introduction. Ronald Reagan once remarked that the trouble with our liberal friends is not that they are ignorant, but that they know so much that isn't so. His comment goes to the heart of one of the most contentious issues in democratic theory. How should democracies handle false beliefs? False beliefs present a potentially serious challenge to democratic theory and practice, as citizens with incorrect information cannot form appropriate preferences or evaluate the preferences of others. Kuklinski and colleagues have demonstrated that incorrect beliefs, and now this is distinct from a mere lack of information, a more thoroughly studied phenomenon, are widespread and underlie substantial differences in policy preferences. One explanation that Hoffman and colleagues discuss in their paper is referred to as the information environment explanation, which suggests that the false belief about Saddam Hussein and 9/11 arose primarily from the Bush administration's campaign, which was riddled with false information and innuendo that explicitly and implicitly linked Saddam with al-Qaeda. However, Hoffman and colleagues were also able to show experimentally that there is another social psychological explanation, that of inferred justification. This is going to be an important term, which contributed to the creation and persistence of this false belief. Now in this experiment, and I'm just going to summarize the highlights, because it was a very detailed experiment. They gave participants challenge interviews, wherein reliable information was given to counter their false belief. Primarily 2 newspaper articles reporting that the 9/11 Commission had not discovered any evidence linking Saddam to 9/11, and even a quote from President Bush himself denying any claims of the link between Saddam and al-Qaeda. The responses were varied and very interesting. Here are some examples of the strategies that people use to resist information that contradicted their beliefs. First, several respondents who had earlier claimed to believe that Saddam was linked to al-Qaeda simply denied making this claim in the first place, even though it was recorded on the initial survey. In one case, a participant begins by saying that he did believe that Iraq was involved in 9/11 attacks, but then corrects his statement claiming that he knew it was Afghanistan all along. In fact, when the interviewer actually shows him his prior written statement, he continues to deny believing what he answered, even though it was clearly laid out before his eyes. And remember that example I told you about how information is taken in through your eyes and it goes to the limbic system first, so you have an emotional reaction and arousal that affects what you see. Okay? These are some of the strategies that Hoffman and his colleagues highlight in their paper. And these are strategies that people use to resist persuasion, and these are all well known in psychology. So obviously denial, claiming that one did not actually believe what one previously claimed. Counter-arguing, directly rebutting the information. So for example, some respondents could not provide any evidence to support their belief, surprise, surprise, so they fabricated a reason. These people claimed that Saddam had to have been involved because of his hostility towards the U.S. and his support for terrorism. To quote one of the respondents directly, "I believe he was definitely involved with it because he was definitely pumping money into the terrorist organizations every way he could. And he would even send $25,000 to somebody who committed suicide to kill another person to their family." Like how exactly did they know that? Another one was attitude bolstering, bringing facts that support one's position to mind without directly refuting the contradictory information. This was the most used strategy, wherein people would often just change the topic or start talking about other good reasons why the U.S. was justified in going to war with Iraq.